My name is Robert Vaš. I'm the president of GlobSec, which is one of the leading think tanks in Central Eastern Europe, and I'm extremely happy that the room is so full. I was thinking yesterday that because we start so early morning that it will be empty, but you are very interested in what are the stances of West towards China. So let me welcome you here on the session which is called Deterrence and Decoupling, Decoding the West-China Stance. We have an excellent panel here. So let me welcome here Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Alison Hooker, Senior Vice President, American Global Strategies, US, Abigail Vassilier, Head of Foreign Relations, Mercator Institute for China Studies, Germany, Matt Turpin, Senior Advisor, Palantir Technologies, USA, Teddy Banzel, Head of Geopolitical Advisory, Lazard, USA. So this is a great panel. We have something like 50 minutes to discuss, so I would like to really have quick points from you at the very beginning. But as the description of panel was describing that from the vantage point of the Indo-Pacific, the West's narrative on dealing with China's rise appear increasingly confused. Western business countries to depend upon Chinese productivity and industrial heft, and decoupling has become derisking. The Chinese government appears confident of rising above any tech-based embargoes and has shown any sign of decreasing pressure, has not shown any sign of decreasing pressure on Taiwan. We have been throwing here a lot of buzzwords on China describing West approach like decoupling, deterrence, derisking. The latest one, derisking, sounds particularly it sounds nice, but particularly confusing. As Carl Bildt has put it recently, he said that, he put it very nicely, that risk management is absolutely normal and necessary part of every strategy, whether business or political one. And if we haven't been trying to manage risks before, we must have been incredibly stupid by any business measure. So my first question goes to Carl Bildt. How do you decipher the current Western strategy towards China? Of course, provided there is one. And what does it mean and what does it aim to do with China and how?
Well, as you point out, if there is one. And I do think it is difficult, because if we talk about China, we are talking about evidently a huge country. Roughly sort of, well, second biggest economy in the world. Still growing, although with its own economic difficulties. Permanent member of the Security Council, the largest emitter of what affects our climate. X numbers of things. That means that any policy towards China has a number of different components. And when I look at the policy pronouncements that are there, I think they sort of catch the complexity of the issue rather well. The Europeans have this famous phrase, I think it's partner for cooperation, economic competitor, and systematic rival. I'm not quite certain what systematic rival means, as a matter of fact, but that's a separate issue. The Americans, Tony Blinken, says the strategy can be summed up in invest in your own capabilities, align, cooperate with different partners, and then compete. And I think these sort of slightly complex ways that Washington and Brussels have found of expressing it sort of catches the fact that there are very many dimensions to it. There's evidently the competition aspect. The competition aspect has a political dimension, obviously. We can see that in the battles in the Security Council or in the global debates about the structure of the multilateral system or the global system, where on the one hand, China is fairly assertive when it comes to how they define their interest in different ways. On the other hand, of course, they do have some points, by the way, as has India, in the sense that it's a 1945 global system, and they consider that that system needs to be adjusted somewhat to take into account the fact that the world looks somewhat different. So you have that particular aspect. You have the economic aspect. which for a long time dominated the relationship. It is the Chinese economy has for the last years been roughly a third of the total growth in the global economy, so it's a fairly substantial, to put it rather mildly, actor. If I compare with India, EU trade with India is roughly 2% of EU trade. EU trade with China is 9–10%, so it's a completely different dimension in that particular respect. And the economic relationship, as you pointed out, has aspects both of opportunities that are there, a huge market. When I talk to business leaders on these de-risking aspects that you said, yep, de-risk or risk management, China has two aspects of it. There could be risks being there because of competition. There could be risks not being there because of market size and because of the fact that you need to be there early in order to meet the competition. You need to understand where the Chinese are heading, because if you don't meet them first in China, be absolutely certain that you are going to meet them on the African or the Southeast Asian or the European markets a couple of years down the line. So a number of different aspects to it. And this has meant that it has been a somewhat complex relationship. Add to that, if you talk about systematic rival, I have my reservations against the word, because I do remember the time when the Chinese embassy in Stockholm were handing out Mao's little red thing and were trying to finance the Communist Party in Sweden. It didn't go very far, to put it very mildly. It had an exotic element to it. They've given up that particular aspect of it and concentrated more, I think, on sort of saying the impact on the global system. Where is China in this big global system? So it's a different sort of rivalry we have there. The important rivalry we have now, I would say, is the technological and scientific rivalry. And that has dominated quite a lot of the American discourse on this, where no question the Chinese have been making massive advances in science and technology. You can discuss whether they are ahead or whether they are just behind, but it's a question of, from the European point of view, a somewhat disturbing aspect, that the technological rivalry in the world today is a rivalry primarily between the Americans and the Chinese. And we Europeans, in a couple of sectors, telecommunication and others, we are fairly good, but in a lot of sectors we are falling behind. And increasingly we see this dominating then the EU-China relationship, with the fact that the Chinese are very good at the technologies of the green transition in different respects, and how we should manage that. Both the need for those particular technologies, the risk of being too dependent on them, and the trade aspect of it, and the industrial policy. I'm not going to say very much more, because I think we should leave some room for debate, but just say that when you look at these two ways in which Washington and Brussels tries to formulate the policies, I think they illustrate the complexity of the issue. The competition issue, the rivalry issue, the cooperation issue, and the need also to look at how do we together align a global system of cooperation where, with all of the competition that is there, we live in a world where we need to manage climate change, we need to manage global health, we need to manage perhaps also the rise of artificial intelligence. So few issues are as complex as our relationship with the still emerging Chinese power.
So the relationship is very complex, and we will come back to some of the points you have mentioned, especially the tech and scientific rivalry later in this discussion. But let me turn to Alison. As we are flying here to India, a delegation of US lawmakers, led by Republican Mike Gallagher, was flying to Taiwan. As expected, China is not particularly happy with it. Yet overall, despite of new rounds of trade and export restrictions, you and China seems to be more on a conciliatory streak, trying to somewhat mend the relationship. What do you think will be the priorities of US in relations to China, and how will the elections and the campaign influence the relationship?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. It's great to be here. among you today. Well, I think the top priority for the U.S. looking at its relationship with China, particularly this year, is to not have another global crisis on its hands, particularly in the election year. So the top priority will be to continue that dialogue you just mentioned. Of course, we set out to re-engage with China starting in November of 2022 when President Biden met with President Xi on the margins in Bali. And that really set on course what Washington hoped would be continuing improvement of relations all the way up until this year. Of course, the spy balloon incident set that back quite a bit, and we spent the first half of last year the Biden administration spent the first half of last year trying to recover that ground. But I really see that improving the relationship, continuing the engagement with China will be the top priority for the rest of the year leading into the election. Sort of subsequent to that is what you've mentioned about Taiwan. To be able to improve the relationship also depends on how the situation develops with Taiwan. And as you mentioned, we continue to see increasing pressure there, not helped by some of the delegations that have been traveling, but President Biden has made very clear that he will continue to support Taiwan and even defend Taiwan should the Chinese take action against them. And so striking that balance is going to be important as we head into the elections. The second main priority really for Washington and for the Biden administration is winning the election. And that is, China is going to be a huge part of that. The American public have been very attuned to what's going on with China, particularly following the pandemic in 2020. And what we've seen is a real bipartisan interest in development with China, and you're going to continue to see that as well. So some of the things that we'll continue to see in this year regarding the election, because of the concerns of the American people, you're going to see continued export controls being rolled out by the Commerce Department. You're going to see continued debate on the Hill about how we deal with such issues as the technology issues and how China has access to the American markets. So I guess I would just say that in the coming months, what we would expect to see is a continued effort to engage with Beijing, and then also that China becoming even more highlighted as we lead into the elections. I'll stop there for now and happy to discuss further as we continue.
Thank you. We'll be picking up some of the points you have mentioned in the conversation. Let me move to Europe, Abigail. Now, for the first time, the EU is planning to sanction companies in mainland China for helping Russia circumvent sanctions and buy dual-use goods. Back in October, also, EU has launched an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles, as the EU is worried that cheap, subsidized Chinese EVs are flooding the European market, and given the unfair subsidy advantage on the Chinese side, European cars cannot compete. So it seems that the relationship here seems to be getting quite dicey. Yet in some parts, for example, I'm from Slovakia, not far from Slovakia, just an hour drive to the south, neighboring Hungary, BYD, the same company that sells more EVs than Tesla and that the EU is worried about, has announced the construction of a formidable assembly plan for its cars, the first in Europe. This all seems to be quite contradictory and confusing. So can you help us to decipher what are the main EU priorities in relation to China in the upcoming year, and how the EU elections that is coming up in June would affect this relationship?
Thanks, Robert, for the excellent question. I'm very happy to be here too, and very impressed by the number of people who came at 7:30. So thanks. And I think if you had to describe in one sentence what is a European priority vis-à-vis China today, it's very much like the US, which is to manage constructively a very difficult relationship. And Carl has laid out what the European approach in managing this complex relationship is about. In terms of priority, and I think this is the first thing you talked about, Europe is at war today, and it's dealing with the fact that China provides an economic and political lifeline to Russia. This is a very difficult question for Europe, which is how do you juggle between your first trading partner that basically supports the country you have identified as an existential threat for the security and the stability of the continent. You talked about sanctions. There are many other ways through which the Europeans are trying to address that. But I would say in dealing with China, this is becoming a key priority, how to avoid that China provide that support. The second priority, and Carl depicted very well, we exchange 2.3 billion euros per day with China today. It makes it our first trading partner, and you depicted very well the challenge between competitiveness and how do we ensure European long-term competitiveness with derisking, and how do we secure our supply chains. And this capacity of Europe today to reconcile derisking with competitiveness, I would say this is our priority, especially when the elections are coming. This is going to be at the core of the election in later this year. The third priority for Europe is the idea that since 2019, the European Union has equipped itself with a series of defensive instruments which have to do with protecting our economy, protecting our security, our prosperity, our capacity to have a sustainable future. And we have developed a very solid defensive toolbox, and you mentioned the anti-subsidies investigation. We have a very solid FDI screening mechanism, and the capacity of the European government today to continue ensuring that through defensive mechanisms, we can ensure our future together. That's a key priority, and that's going to be a challenge for whoever is going to be in power in the next term. And the final priority for Europe, we are a funny place because we are a multilateral. We are multilateral at 27, but we are also functioning as unilateral entities, right, with our own priorities. So one challenge is always to maintain unity, and maintaining unity in the China context is for Europe by its own essence a challenge in itself, and to continue maintaining the convergence we have had with our partners. I think we have reached a very high degree of transatlantic convergence in dealing with China. Maintaining that in the context of the US elections, that's going to be core for the Europeans in their capacity to deal with China. To respond to your question on the EU elections, I think we need to be very clear that the populist parties are going to have more space and gain more space in the European public debate, and we will have to deal with that. But Orban is not Meloni, Fico is not Mélenchon, so there is a very diverse landscape when we talk about the populist parties across Europe, and their capacity to align and define a common political agenda, especially on foreign policy. This is not at all a given. So it does mean that we are going to have a fragmented landscape, and by default, it will mean that the mainstream parties, which have been the key drivers of our China policy in Europe, are going to basically remain the key driving force in Europe in defining what our European policy on China is about. And there is in this room a very good member of the European Parliament who explained to me recently, I think one of the main success of the European Parliament has been to build up consensus. And I completely agree with Reinhard when he told me, Abigail, this was our success in the previous mandate. And if we look at the way the elections are looking at, we are likely to have a very good consensus when it comes to when it comes to unfolding the European priorities that I've laid out.
Thank you. So with the elections, you're seeing the stances and the policies converging or diverging? Converging.
Converging.
Okay. So let me move to Matt Turpin from Business, Palantir. And let's bring another dimension to this discussion that was mentioned also with CarBuild earlier today, and that's the tech competition. Because today everything is about tech, and let's be more specific about data. Data centricity is reality, and everything centers on data. Data availability and connectivity. Chinese have made AI its national priority and directed enormous organized resources into it, even more so in military and national security applications. Can the US and Europe have an edge over China, given that China has no problems with data collection and using AI tools in everything from healthcare to military? And can we decouple the two worlds, Chinese and the Western, and do we want to? And what does it mean for also other countries also in this region?
Well, thanks, Robert, and thanks to the panelists, and we're all good friends, and ORF for inviting us here. I think I'd start with the initial question is, can the U.S. and the European Union can compete given sort of Beijing's activities in the data collection and use of AI space? And I think it's a resounding yes. And in fact, we've been fielding these things quite well. It's not clear to me that Beijing's policies around data collection provided an absolute edge. In many ways, Beijing has been shutting itself off from a broader digital world for a number of years now. So if you ask sort of what does this look like over time, it looks like the sort of digital ecosystems, the divided digital ecosystems that exist today. Beijing has its own one inside the Great Firewall, and then there is the digital ecosystem that sort of exists outside of it. It's very diverse. It can be very messy, but it leads to innovations that I think are quite impressive. So it's not clear to me that the direction that Beijing is taken on its sort of sovereign data and control is necessarily going to lead to better outcomes over time. I think much of the progress that they've made up to this point has been in their historical efforts to open themselves up to the broader world and to engage with the rest of the world, and that these decisions by Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese Communist Party is really cutting themselves off from a far more diverse and open ecosystem. I think at a broader level, sort of what does this all mean? I think it's very clear that we have entered into an age which is a little bit different than the kind of world that we had imagined that we would be in at the end of the Cold War. We had imagined that we would move in this sort of liberal, open, free flow of goods, labor, capital, ideas across borders. And I think what we've witnessed over the last decade or so is a deep securitization of the economic, financial, technological, and industrial domains. And of course, Beijing led this effort. They sort of moved down this path. And what we've watched is Europe, Japan, the United States, India, and others react to that and have begun to build things to reduce their vulnerabilities and to make themselves more resilient to the kind of world that the second largest economy looks like it's seeking to build. And so what that means for I think businesses is that the idea of how you would set up your business a decade ago or 2 decades ago, right? The sort of the idea of maybe the Harvard Business School sort of best ideas of like how do you set up a multinational would not be the way you would set it up today, because the geopolitical conditions have deeply changed from where they were a decade or 2 ago. And so that is causing a ripple effect across a variety of domains. The technology domain is an important one. You can see there is sort of a very robust rivalry that's taking place. It's seen, particularly in the space of dual-use technologies, ones that have both commercial and military uses. And if you look at AI, if you look at semiconductors, those are very much dual-use technologies. Those are areas that rivals are going to compete over. And then that's going to drive business and investment decisions going forward. And to be honest, I think the United States, Europe, Japan, India are well placed as that competition unfolds. And I would not trade places with the position that the PRC and its companies are in.
Let me right away follow up on this business angle and turn to you, Teddy, and ask if the companies from Europe and US now, as we see how the Chinese economy is doing, are ready to decouple more?
Well, and first of all, thank you all for coming, and I'm really glad and excited to be here on this distinguished panel. So, to answer your question, it's hard to generalize, because thinking about Western companies, I mean, it's so complex and gets nuanced very quickly, which I can talk about. But, in the abstract, right, I think the answer to your question is generally yes, in that the kind of slowdown in the Chinese economy is changing the calculus of Western businesses. That's making it less of an attractive market for investment. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of kind of a C-suite or a boardroom of a Western company, right? It's all about managing and weighing risks versus opportunity. And on the risk side, there are geopolitical and policy considerations around export controls, the Taiwan issue, tariffs, et cetera, as well as, and we haven't talked about this yet, kind of China's own domestic policies towards Western businesses, which are a big concern, for a lot of companies that are investing in China, things like exit bans and crackdowns on specific Western companies. So you have those risks, which have increased over the last 4 to 8 years. And then on the opportunity side, China is still it's the second largest economy, as Carl mentioned. So it presents a huge amount of opportunity for businesses. But I think the prior calculation where an 8% growth rate, as a much stronger growth trajectory, stronger domestic market is changing a bit, so that opportunity is decreasing. And frankly, a lot of Western companies are facing more intense pressure, competitive pressure from Chinese domestic companies, in particular, as China pours money into through industrial policy into kind of self-reliance and standing up its own national champions in critical industries of the future. So that calculation has changed overall, and I think you're seeing it show up a bit in the data, right? Last year, FDI into China dropped 80%. That was, and in the third quarter of last year in particular, there was negative FDI into China, and that includes both starting new businesses, investing, or pulling out, as well as repatriation of profits, reinvestment of profits. And so, in the third quarter of last year, there was negative FDI. This is the first time since the data was recorded in 1998. And I think it's no surprise that that happened at a time when we were all in kind of peak pessimism around the Chinese economy, right? So clearly, the view of China's own trajectory economically is shaping a lot of business decisions around how much they want to de-risk. That said, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very nuanced picture, right? And so, in some areas, you have companies that are investing even more in China. Germany actually saw an increase in FDI last year into China to a record high. In areas like the luxury goods, consumer, industrials, autos. China is such a critical market that it's too big to ignore. So it becomes very nuanced very quickly. But I think in overall sense, it is a more complicated picture. And Western companies that are looking to invest their next dollar are now, factoring in some of that lower growth in terms of what they do. And the last thing that I'll say, it's striking, especially listening to this panel, how much today, because of economic competition between the West and China and how central that is to the policy discussion, how much of Western policy around de-risking is being channeled through the private sector, right? And how much of geopolitical policy and competition is being channeled through boardrooms. And, as I mentioned before, it's not just about what Western policymakers do on export controls and tariffs, et cetera. It's about how companies perceive their own risks and opportunities within the Chinese market. So companies are now becoming not just the implementers of policy when it comes to geopolitical rivalry, they're actually becoming actors, right, that have an important, the choices that they make have an important impact on whether the United States or Europe successfully de-risks. And I think this creates a whole new set of kind of policy challenges for Western capitals in particular as they look to kind of de-risk the relationship over time.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the time. We have something like 20 minutes, and before I go to questions in like 5 to 10 minutes, I would like to turn back to you if you want to react. But let me bring in again the question of Ukraine, which we have to factor in when we talk also about Europe's relations to China. When Foreign Minister Jaishankar in 2022 was at the GlobeSec Forum, he said that, why do you think that Europe's problems are global problems? But if you look at the problems in Asia, they seem not to be global. Well, I think that, that as a European from a country which is neighboring in Ukraine, that the conflict in Ukraine is really transformational globally. We are seeing that the global system is under unprecedented pressure, and we are always saying that the defense of international order starts in Ukraine. We are saying that if we are not able to defend Ukraine and the basic principles that you cannot change borders by force, who will trust us in other parts of the world? Who will trust Europe, the United States? And who will be impressed on whatever we say about Taiwan or whatever we say about anything else? So my question is, how does this influence the relationship with China, and how China, in its policies, is factoring in the development and dynamism of the conflict? Because some say in the US that, especially now before the US elections, that basically, Ukraine is just a distraction from the main challenge that US is facing, and that's China, and it's decreasing the resources from the main challenge on China. Well, Ben Hodges is saying that Ukraine is all about China, because if we don't send the right signal that we are ready to defend the international order in Ukraine, who will trust us in the future anywhere in the world? So let me turn to Carl, but whoever wants to answer this question, and let me also factor in the question of sanctions. We had this great conversation also with Radek Sikorsky at the Munich Security Forum a few days ago, at the conversation GlobeSec organized there, and he said, on the sanctions, it's not a problem that if we introduce new sanction packages, the problem is that we are not enforcing enough the current sanctions because there are so many loopholes. So let me turn to you with these questions. And whoever wants to answer it, let me start with Carl.
Well, I mean, two points. One, Ukraine. I mean, not only from the European point of view, but from the global point of view, I think Ukraine is a critical issue. Because either you take the fundamental principles of international system seriously, territorial integrity, sovereignty, or you don't. And what we Europeans say to the Chinese all the time, saying that you Chinese come to us and lecture us about one China and territorial integrity, fine, but then you have to see that that principle applies to Europe as well. Ukraine is an independent sovereign country that's been attacked, and that colors a lot of the dialogue between China and EU at the moment. It has to be said in all honesty, it colors part of the dialogue between the EU and India as well, because the voting pattern of China and India in the UN is identical on Ukraine, which is a disturbing aspect when it comes to our relationship with China. It also affects the trade. The US and Europe are looking very carefully to see if there are any aspects of the economic relationship between China and Russia that can be seen as supporting the Russian war effort. The same binoculars will be directed against India, needless to say, to see if there is anything there. And so far, the Chinese have been rather careful. When Western business have exited Russia, Chinese business have overall not stepped in so far. But of course, we will be watchful because this affects fundamental interest for Europe and fundamental interest for the global system. Another point, if I may, because I think it was Matt who mentioned the securitization of our economies, and that changes the... I belong to those who believe that an open world is a better world in every respect, be that trade or be that politics or be that ideas. But the securitization has started. We need to take that into account. It was started by the Chinese. And I mean, to the detriment of the Chinese, would say. I mean, the problems that we now see in the Chinese economy, we've seen in the last few years, is the fact that they've been starting to do the securitization of their economy because of a number of domestic political factors, I would guess. And the risk that I see, we need to follow up to some extent, but I think we need to be aware of the risk of overdoing it, because then we will do damage to our economy in the same way as we see the Chinese doing damage to their economy at the moment. And the same applies, by the way, to sort of industrial policy, where there's been a tendency by everyone saying, oh, the Chinese are pouring a lot of money into their industries, they're making great success, let's do the same. And then we have a race of industrial policy, starting with the Chinese, then the Americans are doing the same, and then the Europeans are doing the same. At the end of the day, that's not going to lead to a better world, in my opinion. So we need to sort of, yes, securitization is necessary. Let's not overdo it. Let's be aware of the fact that an open world is a better world, and we are the ones, allies across the world, that stand for that.
Matthew wanted to come in as well.
To your question, I think, obviously, both the conflict in Ukraine and the one in the Middle East provide concrete examples of the breakdown in that international system that, as I look back sort of historically, you have someone like Prime Minister Abe, over a decade ago sort of laying out really a real deep concern of what Beijing was doing and how that might manifest. And so as I look at sort of this unfold, for those of us who were sort of paying attention to what was going on about a decade ago, this doesn't surprise us that these kinds of activities are happening. Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East are just concrete examples of that, but we have to sort of look at, these are indicative of this breakdown, and therefore we've got to begin to think about how do we set up a new system that better protects our interests, that deters further conflict, and to begin to move that. And it unfolds in these commercial, economic, industrial, and technological domains. And I completely agree with Carl that this cannot be overdone. It has to be done in a way which reinforces openness and transparency and not a closing off. If we do that, our economies are much more successful than those who choose to close themselves off. And that's probably the path we have to choose.
Thank you. So let me turn to the audience and ask if there are any kind of questions in the last 10 minutes of this conversation. I see two hands at the here. Please, there is a mic. I think you need to go to the mic. I will take 3 questions at once, so you can maybe line up at the mic.
My name is Su-Chen Xu. I'm the Vice Deputy Secretary General of National Security Council from Taiwan. So one question I have in my mind, it's a little bit hypothetical, so please bear with me. There is a possibility that the Trump may come back as the next president of the United States. Do you worry about unity, cross-Atlantic unity, not only in supporting Ukraine, but also Taiwan and other geopolitical disputes? Because this unity probably is the most important pillar of the global security. So I would like to hear from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question.
Morning to all. This is Komodo Watson from Chennai. I look after the Chennai Center for China Studies. As we noticed in all the forums, we've been discussing China. So, just to be a little more provocative, it's quite possible that we allowed China to reach where it is by inaction, whether it is WTO violations or building up of its military or, eavesdropping or whatever it's there. By all this, it's achieved a position where all of us today sitting here are discussing, how is it to contain China. So, maybe we'll learn some lessons and some we have not. So, how do we look at the future? If there is some crystal gazing that can be done on how do you see in the next 10 years, what would be the position of China vis-a-vis the rest of us who are trying to contain China in one form or another? What would it take to ensure that these are not repeated? Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings to the Excellencies present. My name is Sohani Sharma. I am a second-year undergraduate student. My question is, given the change to military generals, China's breaching of Taiwanese airspace, China has limited exports of gallium and germanium. To reroute would mean an active move away from China, which could prompt an immediate shutdown of supply chain. How do you plan to deal with it or create, for example, an alternate sourcing in countries like India? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So who would like to start on answering these questions? Carl.
Well, the first question was, do we worry about the effect of a Trump return? The short answer is yes. Do we worry a lot? Yes. And I leave it by that, because there's such an unpredictability to the entire Trump scenario that it's difficult to be any more detailed about that. But the answer is a yes with fairly big letters all over. Second, there was also a question, the next 10 years. I would say a lot depends on the trajectory of the policies of China itself. If you look at the policies of China, they were immensely successful for quite some time. When they had what they themselves call the reform and the opening up, they have been significantly less successful in the last few years when they have themselves done less reform and do more of securitization of their economy. Will they continue that particular path? That will complicate the relationship with outside world. That would also be, in my opinion, to the detriment of the development of China itself. Will there be a course correction in China? No one knows. The transparency of the political process in China leaves quite a lot to be desired, to put it in the very mildest way.
Thank you. Who would like to?
I'll take the third question, just because we covered the first two. Just on the export ban on gallium and germanium, I think that this is it's an interesting case study, right? And it's not the first time that we've seen these types of export bans, especially on critical upstream materials, from China. Japan obviously lived through this with a ban on rare earth exports in 2010. And I think, this experience, right, demonstrates a couple of things. The first is that, the policymakers in the West are very aware of the potential dependencies, right, from China on these specific critical minerals and other, essential goods and components, and sort of the horse is out of the barn, to use an American expression, in terms of understanding that risk and trying to use policy instruments to correct that and mitigate that risk over time. It's a very difficult proposition, especially for things with, that have to do with mining, industrial production, where there's long lead times. But that change is happening in part, with the tailwind of policy on, from the US, but also EU around greater self-reliance and diversification of supply of upstream materials away from China, given the risk of weaponization. But, it's also driven by private sector concerns, because companies were kind of caught unaware in certain cases around this, gallium and germanium ban. I would say, though, that it's interesting that that was announced, but it didn't necessarily cause huge disruptions in Western businesses. And in fact, it was a little bit like the dog that didn't bark. And, if you think about that, what I just mentioned on the, the trajectory of Western, policymakers shifting away some of those dependencies from China, right now is where China has some of, the peak amount of influence, right, in terms of leveraging its, its control and position in a lot of these value chains in order to, toward geopolitical ends. So the effectiveness of those export bans, et cetera, will diminish over time as Western policymakers continue to enact these changes and businesses respond accordingly, which they're doing today.
Abigail, you wanted to also come in on these questions.
I think very difficult to predict where we are going to be with China in 10 years, but I think what we have come to is a very good understanding that the value gap is just simply going to grow. There will be very little convergence and increasing challenges when it comes to maintaining a rules-based international order, with China being completely remodeling it. And this means that the best thing we have to do is make sure that we all share this common understanding, prepare for the next 10 years, because the challenges are just going to continue growing, and there is a sense of urgency that either we build up the toolbox and the responses that are adequate right now, or in 10 years we are going to look at each other and be in a very terrible place, at least from a European and I think US perspective. That's very clear. If we want to have our automotive industry that survive the next 10 years, it's right now that we need to prepare it. That's in concrete term what it means. I think Theodore explained it very well, what it means to cut down dependencies, reduce vulnerabilities, de-risk. These are things we are doing. And at the same time, China is a unique market for Europe. And it does mean that we need to navigate and work together, policymakers, private sector, civil society, in building a consensus of what it means to work with China, but at the same time to ensure that in 10 years we remain competitive, we have reduced our risks, and we are in a good space. And as regards the transatlantic unity, the secret of this panel is that I was the counterpart of Matt under the Trump administration. And I can tell you, him and myself, we had many fights. But one thing we came up with, it was this idea that despite the fact on the Trump methodology in dealing with China, we had a common assessment of the trajectory. And when it came to Taiwan, we came a long way with both the Trump administration and then the Biden administration in building common understanding of what would be the multiple scenarios. So I'm not going to underplay what Carl has said, which is we are extremely worried. There is a degree of uncertainties, especially when it comes to dealing with China, that is going to come at play if there was a Trump 2 administration. But in reality, we have worked on China in building and trying to build together a space for common understanding. So it may surprise you, but the creation of a EU-US dialogue on China came from us. So you can we have learned we can do that again. And I think on China, it may be a space where there is a degree of convergence. Having said that, it's not going to mean that there will be complete convergence. And we are extremely concerned as Europeans as regards the Trump administration capacity to basically continue to support the European security architecture. And this is basically the underlying fear in Europe today.
Thank you very much. We don't have any more time for additional question, so I will leave this last 1 minute to Teddy and Alison maybe to have the last words. But before, let me turn to Carl, because you said that we are worried. But let us that you stay there. But I think the first question was very important from Taiwan. When we look at the international system that is under huge pressure in Ukraine, Matt was talking about the breakdown of the system. We are seeing that the international system is tested in the Middle East as well. Houthis are stopping the international trade. Would the West be able to deal with another major crisis in Southeast Asia? Would we be able to do it? Because that's also a message that the world is looking right now when we are under, the world is under huge pressure. How we would be able to deal with this crisis?
Well, whether we would be able to deal with it, we don't know. But the priority should be to prevent it. And I think it is preventive action of different sorts, deterrence and engagement, that are the key to preventing that crisis from happening. That should be the priority of policies. And I'm not overly pessimistic. I mean, there's a risk there, needless to say. But there should also be the possibility of handling it and deterring any conflict. That should be the priority.
Thank you, Carl. So, Alison and Teddy?
Thank you. I do want to just return to the question about a potential second Trump administration. And I'm sure Matt gets these questions as well, as both of us served in the Trump White House. I actually served 4 presidents in my 20 years in government, so it's not necessarily just about that. But when I had that question over the past couple of weeks, you have to look at the full 4 years of that time in the Trump administration. And as Abigail mentioned, there are a lot of constructive things that actually came out of that. So I would say there's a lot of time between now and November, and just hold on, put your seatbelts on, because I think it's going to get a little bit wild in the U.S. But the main thing is who is around him should he win. And in the first administration, the first Trump administration, there were a number of great advisors that did help shape the policies, particularly with respect to China, including Matt Turpin, my colleague, Matt Pottinger, who's been in this seat a couple years ago, and myself and others. So stay tuned to that. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm honored to get the last word here in such
You
a
have the
distinguished
last
group. I didn't realize I was going to get this. I'll just make 2 points. The first on Taiwan. I think the question is, is the West prepared or ready to, for another crisis in East Asia? But it's also whether China is ready for a crisis in East Asia. Just when you think about it, beyond Taiwan, obviously being really negatively affected by such a crisis. The biggest economic loser from that type of an engagement is China, just because of the where it is and where that would be located, the cutoff of trade. I mean, there are estimates that crisis over Taiwan would cost the global economy something like $2 trillion just in direct economic activity, not including secondary, sanctions and all the secondary, tertiary impacts. And China would really, suffer from that as well. So, especially as the economy is slowing and it looks like it's trying to take a more constructive posture, as a result, is China ready? And I think is China prepared for that type of crisis? And I would say no at the moment, which is why I'm not on the pessimistic side. I'm again with Carl on that. And then the last thing I would say, because I forgot to mention this as part of the third question before, is just that all of this change in global supply chains, de-risking, diversification, does create massive opportunities for lots of countries around the world. Obviously, and perhaps especially India, just given its size, its growth trajectory. I mean, all of the fundamentals are there, the business interests are there. And so that is the flip side of some of these changes, is it really does create this really important inflection point in the global economy, geo-economy and geopolitics, where there's an opportunity for greater cooperation and, as a result, a huge amount of investment and potential growth in places just like India. And so I think that's an important thing to leave the group with as a final word, just because there's a lot of there's a lot of struggles in the global system right now. But with this type of change, there are lots of opportunities for countries to kind of position themselves accordingly. And so I think that that really does breed a lot of great potential partnerships, economic engagement, et cetera, between the West and places like India.
Thank you very much, and I see the organizers really pushing us to finish, although 50 minutes is not enough for discussing this very complex issue of relations with China. We would need a couple of more hours, but I'm sure that this question will come up in the conversations today and tomorrow in the conference, so I would like to really thank you for an excellent panel this morning. And it is clear that this relationship is very much nuanced and complex, and it will be a mixture of competition and decoupling and derisking, but also on cooperation on many of the issues where we need China at the table, whether it's a climate change or whether it's AI and many other things. So with that, let me thank to the panel and give an applause to the speakers, please. Thank you.
Thank you.